Hey, welcome to our third episode on the Wired for Growth podcast. My name is Michael Pahl. I've got Scott Nieveen, Chad Hummel with me today. Today we're going to be talking about interview tips and tricks. Chad, as our guest this week, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Like Michael said, my name is Chad Hummel. I work for a company called Cedar Holdings, which is a holding company for multiple different businesses. And I am in charge of HR for all of those different businesses. Have been in HR for a little close to 2 decades, in different industries, been in manufacturing, been in healthcare, now in this capacity. So I'm excited to be here.
Chad, give me just a wild guess. How many interviews have you been a part of, do you feel?
Oh my goodness. I don't even know that I could give you a number of interviews that I have been in or have been a part of. Hundreds and hundreds over the years.
All right, give us one horror story of an interview real quick before we get started.
Putting me on the spot for sure. I don't know that I have a specific example, but we've had some where you have the uber stressed out and nervous candidates in an interview process. I mean, the whole shirt is just pitted out, right? And that's always really entertaining after the fact. But really, probably the more memorable ones are the ones that just have really unusual answers or just you don't ever know what's going to come out of their mouth. But I don't know that I have a perfect example to give you.
Okay, fair enough. Well, today we're going to be talking about interviews from two different perspectives. We're going to get started with some interview tips and tricks from the employer perspective, and then we're going to give some tips and tricks to those who actually might have an interview lined up here in the near future. Well, let's dive right in from the employer perspective. So one of the things I really wanted to talk about today is I feel like a lot of interview conversations start at the interview. Here's how you could conduct an interview. Here's the types of questions you ask. I feel like the conversation really starts a long time before the interview. It starts with identifying your core values. What are you looking for out of prospective employees that you're trying to bring into your organization? Scott, tell us just a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for somebody who really is trying to be the gatekeeper of culture in our environment, it's critically important that we get people that align with our core values and then are going to mesh with the existing culture, because you get somebody that, is kind of operating out of a different set of values, and all of a sudden you got conflicts and lack of alignment pretty quickly.
Now, when we talk about core values, are we talking 20, 15? What's a good number here? Just
I think 3 to 4, and it isn't just the core values that are in your glossy brochure or on the wall or whatever. It's ones that people can readily see evident if they spent a week following people around, that they would see, real evidence of that.
Now, we worked really hard to incorporate core values into the interview process. Why don't you cover 2 of our core values? I'll cover the last 2, but just talk a little bit on what they are and how we've incorporated them in. And it's been a process. We're not there 100%, but I think we're making really good strides.
Yeah, one of them for me, I'm pretty relational, as you guys know, but build meaningful relationships. That's key for us. And it's really both internally with our coworkers, but also externally with our clients. We just feel like at the end of the day, you spend so many waking hours at work that, let's have regular relationships and not just these business transactional relationships. And, it just goes so far, especially with coworkers, when you actually know the other person and have had some time and experience with them. When you maybe have a disagreement or see things from a different point of view, it's just that much easier when it's like, but I know Michael, and that's probably not what he means. Let's get through this.
A lot more grace right off the bat.
Yes, absolutely.
What's another core value that you feel we've been able to incorporate into the process?
Yeah, I think the other one is always be curious and continuous learning. Super important, especially it's important in any field, but IT is just changing at crazy, rate of speed. And so for people to just have that mindset of, what else can I learn? How can I improve what I'm already doing? One of the questions I love to ask is, what's something you're growing in right now?
Scott, I totally agree. And 2 of our other core values, act with integrity and respect, and create raving fans. And one of the main takeaways I wanted people to get from this podcast is, once you have your core values established, once you can integrate that into the interview process, spend a little less time on the technical expertise. Now, I think if you're hiring a pilot, you got to know how to fly the plane. If you're hiring a brain surgeon, you got to be able to do your job. But and Chad, you've seen this evolution in us as well. We really focus on adherence to those core values and the soft skills, because our whole theory is it's harder to teach those on the job. How have you seen this in your career, and have you seen this shift in other businesses as well, focusing on soft skills and teaching the other skills on the job?
Yeah, I mean, it really is industry dependent, right? I mean, in your industry, you do have to have some education and some background to be able to do software engineering, for example, right? You got to have some of those.
Absolutely.
Specifically, early in my career, when I was more in the manufacturing setting, where skill sets are can you put things together, right? To a certain extent. And so it really is important to have people that want to show up on time, want to have a good attitude, want to be committed to the workplace. And so those softer skills really are important to explore, especially in the interview process from the employer perspective. So you know who that person is, right? I think it's important for us to have a good value proposition to share, like your core values and benefits and compensation and all of that, but certainly trying to match up who we are with the soft skills are really important.
No, I think, you just clarified a really good point. It is very industry specific. What are some ways in which, organizations can check that box? Okay, we evaluated the technical competency, but also we check the box. Okay, they're able to plug into a team. They're hungry, they're humble. These other soft skills. What are some ways that organizations can easily incorporate both sides?
Yeah, part of what you were already talking about is being prepared, right? And I think that's huge from an employer perspective. There have been interviews in my career where I have been totally distracted with something else, and I've walked into the midst of an interview or to start an interview, and I'm like, okay, what am I doing, right? Where am I at? What am I even talking about? What am I trying to do? Who is this individual? Admittedly, I've been there.
Especially when it's your fifth one of the day.
Oh, right? Easy.
Yeah. When you're on a string of interviews, it gets really hard. But being prepared and knowing what I'm looking for, who we are as a business, and how that individual is going to fit into whatever their role is going to be, but how they're going to be integral into my business. Being prepared and having those thoughts already in mind is huge when going down that path.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think we've come a long way in being prepared. Some of us like to wing, these a little bit more than others. But Chad, if somebody wants to come really well prepared to an interview, and maybe in their current organization they don't have a great mentor in that area, what are some ways they can hone this skill other than experience? It'll come with time, but what are some ways they can hone this skill?
Yeah, I mean, I think seeking out that counsel, right? Everybody knows somebody that works in a different capacity than what they do, and reaching out and saying, hey, what are some positive things that you've had go on in an interview, or what are some of the missteps, which is probably better, that you've had in so that they can prepare. But from an employee perspective, which is what I think you're asking, I mean, you're researching the company, you're trying to prepare yourself to know exactly who they are, and what may come up from an employer perspective. You're doing research. You know what the position are, you know what the responsibilities are. You're doing research on the position before you even walk in the door is the best way to be prepared.
Yeah, that's great. Anything to expand on that, Scott? I think it makes a lot of sense.
I think one of the things I'm always looking for is when I shift to, hey, do you have any questions for me? It's kind of a tell when they don't have any questions prepared. And so I know I've always coached others to say, hey, you need to have 2 or 3 questions prepared besides what you're talking about, Chad, of knowing the company as best you can, because it just shows, your willingness to dive in and kind of find out what you're getting into.
Yeah, it's all about engagement, right?
Right.
You're engaged in the process, and you actually want to work here.
Absolutely.
Right? So many times in my career, especially in kind of the manufacturing setting, I'll call people to set up an interview, and they're like, who are you? Who do you work for? What do you guys do? They have no clue, right? And that's a tall tale sign that they're probably not long for your business, right?
That makes sense. So we've talked a little bit about having your company core values clearly defined. You're hiring the right people into the organization, really critical. We're coming prepared to the interview. I've had a lot of interviews where I was not prepared and they didn't go very well. And most of them, actually, I tried to call a second interview and try to make things right. But really good point there. let's talk a little bit about the actual interview process. So we're, laying out the groundwork. There's a lot of work that needs to be done prior to the interview. Once we get into the interview, what are some things that employers can do to be successful, Scott?
Yeah, I think for me, Chad, you alluded to, the interview where the guy is just, or the gal is so nervous, they just almost can't even be themselves. And so one of the first things I really try to do is just kind of de-escalate and kind of relax them a little bit. Just get them talking about something in their life. Yeah, you learn a little bit from them, but it's really just kind of setting them up for being able to give better answers and things like that. So I always like, leading with, hey, let's just make a connection here before we get into like the nuts and bolts of the interview.
I've actually said, all right, I know that we're in an interview, but this is just a conversation.
Yep.
I want to get to know you.
Perfect.
I want you to have the opportunity to get to know me. And that really just calms those nerves. I mean, it's still a little nerve-wracking for them, but it calms those nerves when you just lay it on the table and say, hey, I'm a real person.
Right.
Yes, I'm the person that's going to be making a decision on if you work here or not, and you want this job, but I just want to get to know you, right?
Yeah, it's not an interrogation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you feel, what percent of the candidates do you feel like are able to get over that hump? I mean, is this a major issue for a whole lot of people out there?
I think it really probably depends somewhat on the interviewer as well.
Sure.
And if that's genuine, right? Sitting down with me, they know that I'm just trying to get to know them. I use a little bit of humor. I try to relax things just with tone and the questions that I'm asking. So it has a lot to do with the employer as well. If you got somebody that's come in there straight laced with their tie and the suit on, and they're going to make this a torture, it's not going to be easy. Even if they say, "Hey, this is just an interview. I want to get to know you," right? So I think it's some on the employer as well. But you got to take a couple of deep breaths and have confidence that you have done research and you know who you are and you know what to sell.
Yeah, makes sense. One of the things I want to talk about today is when you're in that interview itself, what are a couple things you can focus on? And totally want to give credit to Patrick Lencioni for this. He came up with kind of three areas to focus on, and it's whether a candidate is humble, hungry, and smart. And man, we've made major shifts to focus on these things, and it has really paid dividends. Now, I just want to clarify. So smart it's not book smart. It's really referring to, do they have emotional intelligence?
Yep.
Are they self-aware? Can they read the room? Can they read the conversation? So smart is really referring to EIQ, which I think is really critical. Humility, also to clarify this piece here, it's not talking about, do I think poorly of myself? It's just, am I able to think about myself a little less? Or am I able to self-reflect? Am I able to be transparent and honest? And I think too many times we think about it in terms of, somebody having a low perspective of themselves, which is not at all what we want. Scott, we've been able to incorporate, I think, searching for these three values really, really well. Talk to me a little bit on how would you prioritize those three?
Wow, that's a good question, because man, they all have their place. I would say, if anything, I try to explore all three. And if I see that there's one that's kind of, a distant, lagging one, trying to uncover why that might be. I remember we did an interview with a guy that was extremely, very not believing in himself. And you almost felt like you're trying to coach him through the interview. Like, hey, dude, like, you're probably better than you're talking about
been
yourself.
There several times. Yeah.
But it just, it was evident that, wow, that's going to be tough for him to maybe be in front of a client and start getting some questions when he doesn't even have confidence in himself, let alone represent our company.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And I clarified two of the three, but that third one, hunger, I want to make sure that doesn't mean workaholic. It doesn't mean that they get their entire identity through work. It just means that they've got drive and they're willing to incrementally improve and push forward. Self-starter, absolutely. So, Chad, how would you maybe rank these three?
I don't know that there's a perfect ranking of these three, right? Yeah. Because it's all qualities that we're looking for, and I don't want to cop out of that answer.
Sure.
But quite frankly, I mean, you look for all three of those because they're meaningful in different ways, right? hungry shows ambition, right? You can see hunger in the way that they've prepared, that they want to work for you. That's very evident, right? And that's going to translate into the workplace. If they're putting our best foot forward on the front hand before they even come into the interview, how tenacious they are in communicating with you before the interview, I mean, you're going to be able to see that hunger come. We also want somebody that's going to be humble enough to not come in and think whatever they're doing, it's the best way, or, whatever it may be. I don't know that there's a perfect ranking in those. And maybe Lencioni would not agree with me, but I don't think it's perfect, but I think you're looking for all those different qualities.
Definitely. And it's really interesting to look at what does a person come across as if they have two of the three or one of the three. And one that I think we run into a lot is somebody who is really hungry, but they're not humble and they're not smart.
Completely.
And I think Lencioni calls that the bulldozer or something to that effect. I think he might make this argument, and I might make this argument as well, that I think humility really is kind of the pinnacle of the three. I think if you can be coached, if you're humble enough to be coached, then I think we can probably get you there. And if you're not coachable, it is an uphill battle.
Tough. Yeah.
It's really
tough.
Very
tough.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about all the work that goes in pre-interview, a couple of points to focus on in the interview. Chad, what's your perspective on this guidance I see out there all the time about, hey, make something unusual about the interview. Mix things up a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, interviews, resumes, it's all in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. Really, in what your preferences are. I'm a guy that if you come in and you try to forcefully make something unusual or memorable about it, it comes across really disgenuine.
Sure.
And so I just want you to be you. If that's unusual, that's going to bleed through regardless of the tactic that you use. I personally want to see who you are, right? If I get a good sense of who you are, especially if it's a good match for the job that I'm trying to fill, that's going to last longer in my mind than anything unusual that you may have done, right? I want to see who you are.
Yeah.
I think that's the best part of the interview.
Michael, I've seen you use this tactic, lots of times, and I think it's asking, some question they haven't really thought about. What's your motive behind that?
Yeah, so I like to ask that. And you and I were recently in an interview where I asked somebody a bit of a curveball question. I thought it was an appropriate work question, but it was a bit of curveball, and I think they were upset that I asked the question.
Well, I remember the question.
Okay.
If I were to talk to the people that work with you,
that's right.
What would they tell me about the kind of worker and what do you like to work with?
And related to that, I've said, hey, what are the names of a couple people that would really endorse you? And then they give a couple names, and I say, well, who's somebody from your job that wouldn't endorse you? And when I asked the question, this gentleman got a little bit upset. And the point, and I won't say it works every time, but the point was, how do they operate when they're under a little bit of stress? Is it to lash out? Is it to melt down? I mean, this fast-paced job, fast-paced company, and I'm not saying you got to be perfect on your feet, but how you react when you're under pressure, hopefully it's lean on your peers, lean on your team. So that's really where I'm coming from.
It really is a variation of the weakness question, right?
It is, totally.
Tell me about your weaknesses. Oh, it's so hard because people don't want to be self-deprecating in the process, but it really shows that emotional intelligence and the fact that they're humble in the process when they're able to say, hey man, these are the things that I know that I need to work on as an individual in the workplace or personally. So I don't look at those as unusual.
Okay.
I mean, you're trying to throw a curveball, and I think that those behavioral questions are fantastic in an interview process. It's the folks that want to do that one thing or say that one thing that really makes them stand out. Those I don't appreciate. Behavioral questions, fantastic.
Okay, good clarity there. Good clarity.
I'm not scolding you on this one, Michael.
Chad, you alluded to this earlier, but just wanted to talk a little bit on selling your organization in the interview process. Now, there's, I think the companies you represent, Winona IT, we always want to operate with full integrity during this process. So there's a fine line there. You want to be transparent. You want to be honest. You sometimes get asked questions that are difficult. How do you sell the organization well through the interview process?
So I've talked about a lot of times in my career this concept of rolling out a red carpet, right? From a not just an onboarding perspective, but from the prospecting perspective. And I think what you're talking about is exactly that. We want somebody to get a good sense of who we are as a business from the very first day, right? They're applying for positions. Did they wait a long time before we called? We called and scheduled them. We canceled the interview on them, right? I mean, there's a lot of missteps that we can have that sometimes are unintentional, but it gives a perception of who we are from before they even step foot onto our campus, right? And then it bleeds right into the interview process. Are we professional? Are we prepared? You really need to have a good value proposition for that prospect, increasingly more in the environment that we're in now, the market that we're in now for employees. There's plenty of other companies out there that probably are going to pay just the same that you're paying or more, right? Yep. And so who are we and what are we selling? And I think that we really need to know that well. And again, we don't want to put a sales job together, right? But I think it's really important to sell who we are and make that an important part of the process.
Scott, I think we've had quite a bit of success doing exactly that recently. And in fact, we've had a couple candidates that had kind of national offers and decided to work with us. What was different in those scenarios? How did we execute that well?
I think it was easy. The culture and what we explained to them of what they would experience on a pretty much day-to-day basis was the differentiator for sure. And it was interesting, some of our recruits we get via recruiter, and he gives me constant feedback that the pros and cons list, what tipped us over the scales was the culture aspect and the relationships and the core values really that we talk about.
Yeah. Can you peel back what you mean exactly by culture? Just if a listener maybe doesn't experience that in their workplace, what are you referring to exactly?
Yeah, I think, some of the ways that I try to describe, when somebody asks me, hey, what's it like to work at Winona IT? And I say, it is a fast-paced environment. We're a service industry, but we're people at the end of the day. And we want to be able to have relationships with our clients, with our coworkers that are meaningful, and we work hard, but we have fun together, and list some of the different activities that we do that are just kind of social in nature and some of those kinds of things. And for most of them that have worked anywhere else, that stands out to them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, let's talk about just a couple of things to avoid if you're really trying to execute this process well. You're trying to bring in the best talent. You've got your core values defined. You know who you're looking for. Let's just talk about a handful of ways this can go south, and I'll start off. I remember in the busiest time of this company's history, interviewing 10, 15 people a week and not always following up on every candidate. And there's a handful of candidates that I've never followed up with inadvertently.
Yep.
What are a couple other absolute killers that you've seen? And it's okay if we've done them. That's
I think for sure just that continuity of communication when you say, if they ask, hey, what's the next step? Hey, you can hear back from me by the end of the week for sure. I think it's following up on those kinds of things. I think the other part a lot of times is we have a next step queued up. Yeah. And it's making sure that person is diligent on getting that scheduled, because I sometimes had them come back to me and say, hey, I haven't heard anything and it's been a week and a half kind of a thing. And
you got a big
really
fish on.
Bad.
Yeah, when you got a big fish on, that's a spot where they can break away real easy.
I think for me, it's knowing the position in and out and being able to talk through that, right? You might not be the direct manager for that individual. Yeah. From me and most of my career, I'm interviewing for positions that they're not going to be working for me. Sure. I'm interviewing just in general as kind of a baseline. And so I need to know what I'm interviewing for. I do the due diligence from an employer perspective to dive into my departments, to know my business, especially if you're on a larger scale, so that I can talk intelligently with that person. Because if I'm the first person they're talking with and I can't give them an accurate picture of what the job is, they're not going to be interested.
Tough.
Yeah, that's really
tough.
good.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right. Well, we've talked a lot about interviews from an employer perspective. Let's shift gears. If I'm getting ready to interview and it's my dream job, it's a job I really want, let's talk about a few things we can do to be really successful. And I'll start off with one. I think it's really important to have a good first minute or two of the interview. I mean, that initial impression is so critical. It's not the right time to stand out. It's the perfect time to solidify that you could be a great candidate. And it's just be on time, get started in a relational way.
Yeah.
But just have a first minute or two of a really good interview. Just focus on that. Would you agree, Scott?
I totally agree. I think, when the person that comes in to interview can kind of take the focus off of their nervousness and whatever and just say, hey, how are you doing today? Yeah. That's just a simple, great way to kind of get the thing started.
Yeah. Quite frankly, I'm going to back us up before we even walk into the interview. Perfect. A great way to be prepared and make sure that interview is going to be successful is having an accurate perception of yourself as it relates to them in the resume that you're providing to them, right? Is it tailored to the position that you're applying for?
That's good.
Is it truthful? I mean, that probably is the very first one, because I have had people apply for jobs that they lied to me on that resume process.
Yep.
And I have found it out later on after the fact. So that's really important. Just making sure that you're selling who you are before you even walk into the door. That's going to provide confidence in the employer. That's going to provide confidence in you. And then I think it starts off really well from the very beginning.
Can you peel that back just a little bit? So in a real practical way, how do people do that?
Be truthful or?
Yeah, sorry.
Prepare the resume and that kind of thing.
How can they provide a little guidance on how they can ensure that's done?
Yeah, so I think it's having an accurate understanding of what the job is based upon the job description that you've looked at, right? Okay. Because then you're taking your experience and you're really diving into each one of your jobs previously and saying, what relates from this job that I can help to translate that's going to translate that I'm qualified to do the job that I'm applying for. You're listing out all of what's accurate and relatable to that job, I think is really important.
Totally makes sense. Okay, so we're coming in prepared. We're going to have a good first minute or two. Scott, what's some other guidance you would?
Yeah, I think another way to be prepared is just pull up. I mean, Google's such a great resource. Just pull up potential interview questions in the field that you're looking for. Yeah. I think for some people that maybe aren't as quick on their feet to think of answers, man, that just helps give them, hey, here's what I would say if I get asked, this area of question.
Sure.
One of the things that you've always heard about in this process is pick out something in that employer or interviewer's office and be able to talk about it or comment it. Do they have, cult stuff or Notre Dame stuff hanging in the room? Do they have pictures of their family? And as I think about it, I feel like, man, that's really cliche. However, every time that somebody does that to me, it makes me feel really good. Yeah. And not to be self-absorbed in the process, but hey, they're actually trying to get to know who I am, and they're noticing what's going on in their world.
They're just realizing the human aspect of the whole process. Yeah. And I definitely agree. When I've gotten off with an interview and it's instantly technical or instantly diving into the weeds, it's definitely a put off. I mean, it's not what we're looking for from the majority of our hires. We talked a little bit about this earlier about good questions. What are a couple questions people can ask their prospective employer during this process that might separate them from the rest of the pack?
I think it's any questions that show that you have thought about the job, them as an employer, not just, hey, what does it pay?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
What are your hours?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Right. Because that just shows that you're very surface level. Yeah. It's any questions that really dive in and show, wow, they've really actually thought about this, or things that have to do with your business, right? Or your company or your background. Hey, I was researching on the website and I saw that you guys are involved in these charities externally, right? That's really great. Tell me about that, right? Something that shows that they're engaged in the process, not just about what is this job going to do for me.
Right.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. And I think when Chad, it makes me think of, them asking something like, how can I be successful in this role? And you're already giving your employer a chance to speak into it. It isn't just about what I'm going to benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Some advice I want to give folks is every question you get, there's a chance that it's just kind of a random question, but most of the questions you're going to get in an interview are very calculated. And I'll give you a really good example. We like to ask the question, tell me about a major accomplishment in your life. And there's two types of answers. There's the, hey, I did this, I won this, I climbed the mountain. And there's the, I led a team that was, state basketball champions. I was a captain of the team that won the championship, or, hey, as a group, we accomplished this. And in theory, we're separating people who really are focused on themselves as an individual and people who like team accomplishments and working as a team. What are a couple other things you've seen where it's really a calculated question that people should consider?
Yeah, one, it isn't as critical. It does give you a little bit of insight into them, but it tends to throw people. But I'll ask them, how do you like to be shown value and appreciated?
That's a good one.
Yep.
Because I think a lot of times they haven't been, but then when it actually comes down to, okay, what would it look like for me? It's hard for them to articulate it. Now, most of them come up with something, but
yeah, and we're not saying there's a right and a wrong answer,
Yep.
but give me an example of a type of answer that you'd maybe look for in that regard.
Yeah, I think the one that's probably most common and I appreciate is just, hey, I just want to be told occasionally that like I'm doing a good job.
Yeah.
I don't need this big, like take me up front, give me an award, that kind of thing. But I want to know that I'm making a difference.
Definitely. We hear that a lot. Just I'd like it to be clear to my supervisor I'm working really hard and a little bit of positive affirmation.
Yep.
There,
Yeah. So. One really fun question that I like to ask in a lot of my interviews is, tell me something that's important to you outside of your career, outside of your job. Tell me something that's really important to you. Again, it gets us a little bit at ease as it relates to the fact that we're doing an interview, and then it just helps them to think about what is important to me. And again, just another way for me to get to know them.
Another kind of, I'll call it a calculated question is a lot of employers ask, tell me something you're working on regarding yourself. What is something that you've identified and you're working to improve? And most of the time when I ask that question, long pause, there's a lot of thinking, and then there's pretty bad answer at the end of it. But what that's getting at is what's their level of self-awareness and their humility and their willingness to work on themselves, which is a really, really critical aspect, especially when we're interviewing leadership roles.
Yeah. I think another good question for, the interviewee to ask is, what makes this line of work challenging, or what are some of the things that you guys face, every day? I think when they're seeking to understand what it's like to work and provide the services that we do, it tells you they're a couple steps down the road instead of just waiting to be told what to do.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. And that's one of the biggest things as an employer that we're trying to fight a little bit against the notion that we spoon feed or need to provide every next step. So that's a big one. Another question that I wanted to bring up today is I always really appreciate when a candidate asks me, am I filling an empty position because of an exit? Am I, what are the circumstances behind this job opening? And related to that, they often ask, was the last hire at Winona IT successful or unsuccessful? What made it successful? What made it unsuccessful? I think those are really critical questions because they're already aligning themselves with how can I be successful here?
Yep.
And from an interviewer perspective, that's a really fun question. When somebody was promoted or they've moved on to a better situation.
Absolutely.
It's a really hard question when somebody, just got fired in that role before. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. But it is a very good question. Yeah.
That's when you plead confidentiality. Well,
we can't really talk about that.
I suppose I just haven't run into that, to be honest with you. Most of the time it's a new project. It's a new. Yeah, most of the time it's been good, but that's a good perspective, though, Jen.
I think the other thing I appreciate is when the interviewer sends me an email later in the day or the next day, and just writes back, thanks me, for the time. And some of them actually go to the level of, hey, what feedback could you give me on how I could improve in my skills? And man. Super appreciate that.
I had 2 interviews yesterday, and actually I am very privileged. I get to do interviews for a couple of our major clients. This one was for a client and 2 candidates that were just both the soft skills and the technical skills were just a perfect tie. I mean, great candidates, both of them. And one of them wrote me a message after and said, thank you so much. great interview. Any feedback, please let me know. I'd love to refine my interview skills, and just really appreciate your time. Thank you. And I didn't hear from the other one.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense of it was a tie. Now we have one that's in the lead. So I definitely think that's great advice.
It really just highlights how important it is for employees or prospective employees to sell themselves in the process.
Absolutely.
Because there are so many candidates out there for a lot of these positions. And as an employer, as an HR person, I hate to admit this, but there are times where I get stacks of resumes
Absolutely.
for positions, right? Yeah. And it's those folks, I can pick those things out really quickly, even from a resume, and I'm weeding everybody out really quickly. I mean, it is highly competitive out there. And so it's so important to focus on some of these areas. As little as just saying thank you for your time, that cost you the job.
Yeah.
And that was not necessarily inherently a bad thing,
right.
But it did cost you the job.
Yeah.
Chad, you just mentioned resumes, and I don't want us to nitpick too much here, but let's talk a little bit about resumes. We see a lot. Mm-hmm. Scott, how many resumes are you seeing a week right now?
Oh gosh, 10? Probably 10. 10? Easy.
Chad, you're probably seeing at least that.
Tons, yeah.
Without nitpicking too much, how can people get their resume in good shape for, in my case, an executive or somebody who's screening? How can they differentiate their resume?
Here's the deal. I'm going to make a little joke out of this, but there's always a little bit of seriousness behind every joke. If you put your picture on your resume, you're done. You're done. I'm done with you. No, I'm joking. In some contexts, those are really important. If you're applying for a graphic design position, it may be appropriate, right? Sure. Giving some of your personality in some of those positions is really important. I think you've got to look at grammar. You've got to look at spelling. You've got to look at the construction of your resume. Is it concise? Is it easily readable? Again, I hate to admit this, but in my past, in my career, at times I get so many resumes that if I look at it and there is too much going on, I'm already lost.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so I hate to admit that, but I don't have the time to look at every single word. Are you constructing it in a way that is appealing to me as the employer, even as it relates to the aesthetics?
Well, I'll take that one step further, Chad. I actually had a literal stack of resumes I just went through, and every resume that was 3-4 pages long, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, I put that in a pile that I didn't revisit.
Absolutely.
The resumes that were 1 page, I spent the time and I read through the page. Now, maybe there's an argument to be made that it can be 2 pages or what have you. But the average time I probably spent per resume on this stack was probably 2 to 3 seconds.
Yep.
So keep it concise.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd say the other coaching point I would make is that if you're new to the job market and you're coming fresh off of college, what your resume is going to look like is going to be completely different. You're focusing on education,
For sure.
involvement, some of those kinds of things, versus later on, the education still is a piece, but it's really looking at what are the high markers of what you've done in the field.
And what relates to what you're going to be doing
Absolutely.
for me. I mean, that's so important.
You know, and it really, something I hear all the time is, well, I don't have a resume. I'm just out of school. I saw a resume the other day of somebody that had no work experience or very, very little work experience. But on the resume, they described themselves and they highlighted their positive traits. They talked about the fact that they happen to be an Eagle Scout, which I think is huge.
Yep.
They had 4 or 5 bullet points on this list, and they got an internship with us. I mean, you don't have to have the best or the most extensive work experience to produce a resume that catches somebody's eye.
Yeah.
I just think that that's a big
I think the other thing that comes to mind in that is I've talked to some people that unfortunately didn't have the experience that we needed. And I told them, and they had been looking for close to a year.
Okay.
And I said, you know what you might need to do? You might need to just go get that first job, even though it's not in the field that you have, so that you actually have some work experience, because some of that work experience and responsibility is going to set you up for maybe the future job you really want.
Yeah. And just a note on that, and again, it's a little of my opinion, may not be all employers, but if you've got somebody and they have a really extensive work history, but it's kind of a job hopping work history, right? That's going to read through whether you put jobs on there or not. And from my perspective, when I see gaps, it makes me go, what are you doing?
Yep.
Right? Were you working? Were you just not doing anything. I mean, it's better to give me the full picture of your work history versus leaving gaps in there.
Yeah, and I think when we see gaps, like when I've looked at a resume that's had significant gaps that had a bullet point to explain them, that's way better than blanks.
Absolutely.
Left the workplace to raise children for a while, or went back to school, or realized I was in the wrong field. I mean, those really brief explanations go a long way.
Yeah, I've become tremendously cynical over my career, but you're going to let me wander, and I'm probably not going to think, really positive things about gaps and things like that. So,
one of the last things that comes to mind for me that I tend to coach younger people on is, let's say the employer said, "Hey, I'll get back with you in a week," and you haven't heard back from them, and you don't want to bug them. But an easy way to reach out is just reach out to the contact that you have and say, "Hey, I just was checking in. Is there any other information you need from me, or do you have any questions for me?" It gets you back on their radar. It lets you know that you're being intentional and initiating with them, and it's just a good way to close that thing out.
Absolutely. I mean, their follow-up to an appropriate amount, and you touched on that. Their follow-up demonstrates their desire to work for you.
Right.
And I think that's huge. Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
Right. From a follow-up from an employer perspective, it shows that we are actually, we're interested in you, and we're really excited about getting this position filled.
Yeah.
Yep. So since we have talked quite a bit about oddball questions and, the curveballs that can come, here's my curveball for you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you handle when those curveball questions come out from an employer?
Yeah, I think going into the interview, first and foremost, expect one. Just expect one, because then I believe when you do get it, you stand the best chance of being calm and collected. Because that's honestly test number one. Test number one on a curveball question is, can they keep their cool? And can they seem unfazed? So just really expect it going in. You can definitely rehearse several if you Google, curveball interview questions, definitely rehearse a couple. I think at the end of the day, try to understand the root of the question. When I ask the question, hey, who from your current or previous work experiences might not refer you to the job? I'm seeing if they're honest, if they are humble, if there's an ego. So understanding the underlying root of some of the curveball, it's not that the purpose is not just to rattle somebody. I mean, I'm not saying that's never happened, but certainly when I try to throw a curveball, it's not just to rattle them. It's to understand how they deal with stress and how they think on their feet. So understanding, why is this question coming my way? I think that's really critical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you have to dive in and understand, okay, what are you truly asking for?
Yeah.
And it's okay to stop and to pause and to breathe, and not just start into the verbal running of just trying to fill and answer the question.
Yeah,
by putting
don't fill
words
the
into
void.
the space,
Don't just
right?
fill the void with nonsense.
Yeah, it's okay to stop and pause and think it through.
Yeah,
and say,
and I know,
you know what, that's a really good
interview,
question.
3 seconds feels like 30 minutes, So
Yeah. I would say, Scott, I bet a quarter of the interviews you and I do together, I bet we get that response of, let me think about that for a second. And it's not unusual at all.
And that's totally okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially if they have a QA role.
I think another way, Chad, and maybe you're kind of alluding to this, but just to say, hey, can you ask that same question another way?
Sure.
So
yeah, especially if you don't understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, some really good points there. Well, I really want to thank both of you. It's been a great conversation. Hopefully we've provided some value to the viewers. Scott, do you mind just giving us a quick recap on this part two?
Yeah. First off, for employers, have a game plan. Understand what your company's about, what it is your values are, what you're offering in terms of workplace. In a way, you're selling, this potential candidate on your company. The next one is just streamline your process and really have the people that are involved understand that communication is important, timeliness is important, professionalism, some of those things. That just goes a long way to just having a really clear process, following through with people that didn't get the job. I hear that from a lot of people that, I never heard back from the company. And, we always want to make sure that we're following up with people. I think when it flips over to the person that's actually interviewing, it's really being prepared and understanding what is the role I'm interviewing for? how can I leverage my skills, my experiences in form of a resume, and then what I'm prepared to share in person that will actually sell myself to the employer. And, I think keep in mind, how do I show them that I am hungry, I'm humble and smart. I can, I have self-awareness, some of those kinds of things. And then, I think in the actual interview process itself, like try to relax as best you can and really connect with the person that you're interviewing with. That's probably one of the bigger things is even somebody that I think maybe lacks some of the technical skills up front, if they make a connection with me, I'm for sure passing them on to the next round.
Yeah. Total. Really good advice there. Chad, thank you so much again for being our guest today. Really appreciate having you on. I hope the 10 rehearsals before this, wasn't too inconvenient for you. So
no, it was a great time. I really enjoyed being here.
Great. Well, folks, thanks so much for joining again on our third podcast here today, Interview Tips and Tricks. Just want to give you a heads up. Our fourth podcast is going to be released here shortly as well. On this one, I'm really excited for. We're going to talk about the first 90 days, how people can be successful in their new roles in the first 90 days. Really excited about that topic.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for joining us.